G'day. Today we have Exodus 8 and 9, and we're going to talk about the plagues. The first six, we're going to look at the first six this week, and then next week we'll talk about the last four. So remember last week, these plagues, they are acts of judgment from God on Egypt because of their evil, particularly because of their oppression of the Israelites. Because remember that God wants his name and his character to be seen in this story. He wants his name and his character to be associated with the redemption of Israel from their slavery, but he also wants it to be associated with his punishment of wickedness. That's important. This is who God is, and this story, the redemption of Israel, the plagues and everything else, reveals his character. So that's why these plagues are happening. Now let's have a closer look at them. The first 9 plagues are organized into 3 cycles of 3. And then the last plague occurs separately. So the first 3 cycles of 3 are important. They're important to notice the cycles. The first cycle is the plague of blood, the plague of frogs, and the plague of gnats. So let's have a closer look at that one. So the cycle begins with Moses visiting Pharaoh at the Nile. Each cycle begins that way, actually. And he asks Pharaoh to let the people go so they can worship Yahweh, or else a plague will happen. And by the plague, it says, "You will know that I am Yahweh." So God's name is associated with these plagues. And the first plague, it's significant because the Nile River, it was the center of life for the Egyptian society and for all of the people. But it was also one of their gods was Hapi, the god of the Nile. And so Yahweh, in this plague, as he puts a plague on the river, it's a sign of judgment on the people of Egypt, the society, but it's also a demonstration that he is the true and living God above any of the Egyptian gods. And the magicians, they replicate this plague. And because they can replicate it, Pharaoh's heart is hardened and he does not yield to Moses' request. And so the next plague happens, the plague of frogs. And Pharaoh says that the people can go if Moses will just pray that these filthy, disgusting frogs go away. And so Moses does pray that these frogs will go away. And the moment he prays for it, that they disappear. And then Pharaoh changes his mind, says, no, actually, the people can't go. Says his heart is hardened again. Now, the reason this plague is significant is because it's an act of decreation. Remember, God created the world, and when he did create the world, he separated the waters from the land. And he left the sea creatures in the water and the land creatures on the land. Whereas a frog is an amphibian. It lives in the water and in the land. So a frog is, in this story, a sign of decreation. A frog is a sign of God's good created world being messed up or being decreated in order to bring on judgment. And the magicians replicate this with their rabbit out of a hat or their witchcraft or something like that. The third plague in this cycle is the plague of gnats. It's the last plague of the cycle. So Aaron is told to strike the ground and the dust will come up from the ground. It will turn into gnats, which are kind of like mosquitoes maybe or fruit flies or similar. And it says that these gnats will come onto the people and to the animals. Now the significance of this is again in the creation story. God brought the people about from the dust of the earth. And here it's like the dust of the earth is re-engulfing the people. It's again an act of decreation. And yet, Pharaoh's heart remains hard. See, this one's interesting. The magicians couldn't replicate this. They say that it came from the finger of God. They've got no answers. And yet, even though they couldn't replicate it, Pharaoh's heart still remains hard. So that's the first cycle. Second cycle happens. First plague in the second cycle is the plague of flies. Now, this is the first one where we hear that Israel is treated differently. The people who live in the land of Goshen, which is where the Israelites lived, they will be spared. And you ask why they will be spared? So that you will know that I am Yahweh, because Yahweh says that he is living in the land with them. This is a reminder. These actions, these plagues, they're not flukes. God is doing this. So the plague happens and Pharaoh asks Moses to pray that the flies will go away. And if he does, then Pharaoh will let the people go. So Moses prays that they'll go away, but Pharaoh again changes his mind because his heart is hard. Now the plague of the flies, it inverts God's blessing to humanity in Genesis 1 again, to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the land. Now it's flies, which is associated with death and decay. Those things are filling the land. So again, it's an act of judgment, an act of decreation. The second plague in this cycle is the plague on the livestock. And again, it is only the Egyptian livestock that is affected. The Israelite livestock is unharmed by this plague. And Pharaoh, it tells us, he actually investigates to find out if the Israelite livestock was harmed. He sees that it wasn't harmed, and yet he still doesn't yield to Moses' request. His heart remains hard. And then the last of the second round, the last plague, is the plague of boils. Now, this is the one so far that has effects on the body, far worse than anything else. And the magicians, we find out in this story, that the magicians, they can't even come to stand with Pharaoh because they're so affected by their boils. We thought that maybe the magicians were pretty impressive. Now they are just completely weakened at the plague. So that's the first two cycles of the plagues. Now let's go big picture. Do you believe in the God who performs miracles? Is that a part of who you think God is? Miracle worker. Now, it could be that there are some natural causes at work in these plagues. Could be. You know, at the very least, I think that it's safe to say that the hail that's formulated in the seventh plague was probably brought about in the same way that hail always is formulated, through the rain cycle. So it could be that there are other natural causes for these plagues as well. And I know that many people have proposed that as a suggestion. Now, that being the case, that doesn't mean that God isn't doing this. God uses means to bring about things in his world. It's the main way that God brings about things in his world is through means. He makes things occur through the natural causes of the world. And the fact that Israel is guarded on numerous occasions. So that, I mean, you might think that the other things come from natural causes. I actually have no way of explaining the way that Israel is guarded. It doesn't seem likely to have a natural cause. Nor does the fact that the frogs and the flies stop at the exact moment when Moses prays that they will stop. To me, that seems like that is God entering Moses' prayers. But these stories are a reminder to us that our God is a miracle-working God. This makes sense because he is the one who created the universe. And here we see God working his miraculous power to bring about judgment on evil. But you also see God working his miraculous power to protect and to guard his people, the Israelites living in Goshen. But in all these miraculous signs, let's not forget that God is revealing who he is. He wants you to associate this story with his name. He is a miracle-working God. So let me close by asking, what difference might it make to your day today to remember that God can work miracles? See ya.